Did you know it's illegal to lead a cow while drunk in the UK? Yes, you heard it right. This may sound like a peculiar bit of trivia, but it's rooted in the Licensing Act of 1872, a piece of legislation that hoped to curb the unruly behavior that was rampant in Britain during that era. The 19th century was a time of rapid industrialization and social change. With these transformations came a host of public nuisances, many of which were tied to the overconsumption of alcohol. In a bid to restore order, the Licensing Act of 1872 was enacted. This act was comprehensive, covering a wide range of alcohol-related offences. One particular section of this law, which may seem rather quaint to us now, made it illegal to be drunk while in charge of any carriage, horse, or cattle on any highway or other public place. The reason behind this specific provision may not be immediately apparent to us in the 21st century. But consider the context. In the 1800s, cattle drovers, individuals responsible for moving large herds of cows to market, often had to traverse long distances, leading their massive, potentially dangerous charges through towns and along highways. The last thing anyone needed was a drunken drover trying to navigate this task, risking not only their own safety, but also the safety of the townsfolk and other travelers. So, as odd as it may seem to us now, this law was a practical and necessary measure in its time. And while today's cows are more likely to travel by lorry than on hoof, the law still stands. It remains illegal in the UK to be drunk while in charge of cattle, a testament to the enduring legacy of the Licensing Act of 1872. So, next time you find yourself in the UK, remember, no leading cows after a pint or two. You might find this law amusing or even absurd, but let's delve into the historical context. Now let's transport ourselves back to the late 19th century. Picture this. Britain is a country in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Cities are booming, but a large portion of the population still lives and works in rural areas. Here, agriculture is king, and cattle are an integral part of this rural lifestyle. Cattle drovers were individuals tasked with moving large herds of these massive beasts, often over many miles, to markets and fairs. This was no easy task. These cattle were not petite creatures and could become dangerous if startled or mishandled. Imagine trying to control a herd of these animals on a narrow road, or worse, through a populated town. Now add alcohol to this mix. The drover, perhaps tired from his long journey, decides to drink. His senses are dulled, his reactions slowed. The cattle, sensing a change, become restless. A sudden movement, a loud sound could set them off. The potential for chaos, for damage, for injury was immense. It's also important to remember that back then, the public highway was not just a strip of tarmac for motor vehicles. It was a bustling space shared by pedestrians, horse-drawn carriages, and herds of livestock. The risk of an intoxicated drover causing a catastrophic accident was a very real threat. This was the context in which the Licensing Act of 1872 was enacted. It was not just about maintaining public order or reducing drunken misdemeanors. It was about ensuring the safety of the public and the drovers themselves. It was about reducing the risk of accidents that could lead to loss of life, injury, or significant property damage. Given these circumstances, it's not hard to see why the lawmakers of the time felt the need to enact such a law. Fast forward to the present day, and you might wonder, is this law still relevant? We live in a world where cattle are no longer driven through towns and cities by drovers on foot, but are instead transported in large lorries and trucks. The days of the cowboys and drovers, guiding their herds through bustling streets, are now confined to history books and old Western movies. Today, you're more likely to see a cattle transport truck on the highway than a herd of cows being led by a man on foot. The image of a drunken drover stumbling along with a herd of cows seems almost comical in our modern context. But does that mean this law is obsolete? On the surface, one might say yes. After all, the chances of a person getting drunk and deciding to lead a cow down a public highway are pretty slim in this day and age. But despite the changes in our society and our modes of transportation, this law is still technically in effect. Why, you may ask? Well, laws often remain in place until there's a good reason to remove them. And in this case, there hasn't been a strong push to strike this one from the books. Perhaps it's because the law serves as a reminder of a bygone era, a piece of history that adds a touch of charm to our legal system. Moreover, it's worth pointing out that while the specifics may seem outdated, the spirit of the law remains relevant. It's about responsible behavior, about ensuring that those in charge of potentially dangerous animals, or any mode of transport for that matter, aren't under the influence. So while you're unlikely to see many drunk cattle drovers these days, it's still technically against the law. And it's a good reminder that no matter how much society changes, some principles like responsibility and safety remain timeless. But this peculiar law was just one part of the broader Licensing Act of 1872. Indeed, the act encompassed far more than just the prohibition of drunken cow leading. It was a comprehensive piece of legislation aimed at tackling the widespread issue of public drunkenness that was prevalent in Britain at the time. The act introduced a number of other restrictions and penalties in an attempt to curtail such behavior. For instance, it imposed stricter regulations on pub opening hours. Pubs were no longer the round-the-clock watering holes they once were. Instead, they were required to close during certain hours of the day, particularly in the early morning and late at night. This measure was intended to reduce the opportunities for excessive drinking and the associated unruly behavior. The Licensing Act of 1872 also introduced harsher penalties for public drunkenness. Those found guilty of this offense could face hefty fines or even imprisonment. This was a clear message from the authorities. Public drunkenness was a serious issue that would not be tolerated. But the act wasn't merely punitive. It also aimed to encourage a cultural shift in attitudes towards alcohol. By making public drunkenness a crime, the act sought to stigmatize excessive drinking and promote more responsible behavior. In essence, the act was a public health initiative designed to protect the general public from the dangers and disturbances associated with excessive alcohol consumption. So, while the law about leading a cow while intoxicated might seem eccentric and amusing to us today, it represents a small part of a much larger and more significant effort to address a serious social issue. So, while the cow law might get the most laughs, the act as a whole had a serious purpose. Despite the seemingly outdated nature of some of these laws, the Licensing Act of 1872 left a lasting legacy. Down the corridors of time, it has echoed, shaping the course of society in ways that would have been difficult to predict when it was first enacted. The Act's primary objective was to regulate the sale and consumption of alcohol, aiming to curtail the rampant drunkenness that was wreaking havoc in Victorian Britain. It introduced fines for public intoxication, prohibited the sale of alcohol to underage individuals, and yes, it outlawed leading a cow while inebriated. But its long-term effects were far more profound. For one, the Licensing Act of 1872 set the stage for the broader alcohol policy in the UK. It was one of the first pieces of legislation to recognize the societal impact of alcohol misuse and to take steps to mitigate it. This awareness, this understanding that the state has a role to play in moderating alcohol consumption, has remained a cornerstone of UK alcohol policy to this day. Furthermore, the Act also contributed to the professionalization of the police force. It gave the police increased responsibilities and powers, including the ability to enter premises suspected of selling alcohol illegally. This was a significant step towards the development of the modern police service we know today. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Licensing Act of 1872 is the way it has permeated public consciousness. Even though the specific law about leading cows while drunk may seem like a quaint relic of a bygone era, it's a reminder of the evolution of our society, of how far we've come from the days of cattle drovers and open-air markets. So there you have it, a seemingly obscure cow law that's part of a much larger historical narrative. As peculiar as it may sound, it's a fascinating glimpse into the past and a testament to the enduring nature of law.